Hello and welcome back to your Introduction to Psychology class. In this lecture, we'll continue to talk about differences between people, individuals, and groups, and the roles of nature and nurture. That's a question that has social and political implications. We'll consider the lens of evolutionary psychology to explain human differences. We'll also look at the influences of family and culture, and learn about bias and discrimination. When we talk about differences between people on some trait, say height or mathematical ability, we're talking about a variable. A variable is a characteristic that varies between people. It's called a variable. It takes on different values in different people. Height's a variable, and for me, the value of that variable is 5.4 inches, and for you, it might be something different. Age is another example. Some variables have more range in their values than others, and that can be because you're dealing with a restricted sample. So in a first-year class like this, the range for the age variable is very restricted. Most of you are about 18, and there might be a scattering of mature students who are about 25 or 30, and no one's going to be younger than 16 or 17. But now think of variance in age at people attending a public event like a parade, where there's people of all ages, babies, teenagers, young adults, middle-aged people, and seniors. There is greater variability in age in that group. There is greater variance in age in that group. That variance plays an important role in the relationships between variables that we sometimes talk about. The strength of a correlation ranges from between 0 or 1, or if it's a negative correlation, 0 and -1. The first scatter plot on the bottom of the slide there shows a perfect negative correlation, something like your height and the remaining distance between your head and the ceiling. So for every inch somebody is taller, there's an inch less of space between the top of the head and the ceiling. Incidentally, a perfect correlation like that isn't tremendously useful. There's not much point in measuring the second variable if it's completely predicted by the first one. Now, you see more scatter in that second plot of a relationship with a correlation of -0.8, and even more scatter in the relationship with a correlation of -0.5. 0.5 is also about the strength of the relationship you see there between school performance and percentage of students who are eligible for a free lunch in Louisiana. Eligibility for a free or reduced lunch is an indicator of family poverty. These are students in financial need. Overall, the graph suggests that schools with more economically marginalized students have lower school performance scores. That relationship describes a general trend, not a hard and fast rule. So we can see some outliers. This point here on the bottom shows that the school that has the lowest percentage of students who are eligible for a free lunch also has one of the lowest performance scores. That's unexpected. And up here, we can see that there are quite a few schools that have above average performance scores and yet have student bodies in which over 80% of the students are eligible for a free lunch. Those outliers, as we call them, are interesting, and we might want to learn about those schools in more depth. Many of the relationships we talk about in psychology, women are more likely to do this, older people are more likely to do that, are much weaker than that, maybe in the 0.1 to 0.3 range. Take a look at this plot where the magnitude is -0.2. That is a lot of scatter. The percentage of variance in one variable that's explained by the other is represented by the square of the correlation coefficient. If the correlation coefficient is -1, well, -1 times -1 is 1. That means that X, say the height of people in this room, predicts 1 out of 1, or 100% of the variance in Y, which might be the distance remaining between their heads and the ceiling. One variable completely and perfectly predicts the other. What about that very strong correlation of -0.8? Well, -0.8 times -0.8 is 0.64, or 64%. In that case, X, whatever that variable is, predicts 64% of the variance in Y. Correlations with smaller magnitudes become exponentially less useful in terms of prediction. A magnitude of 0.5 or -0.5 is the threshold for calling a correlation large. Well, that means one variable only predicts 25% of the variance in the other. A correlation described as small might have a magnitude of 0.1. That means that one variable in the relationship only predicts 1% of the variance of what is going on in the other. 99% of that variance is explained by other things. The phenomena we observe in life are likely caused by many little things working together. When considering making a decision based on a relationship, it's not good enough to do so merely on the basis that the relationship exists. You do well to ask how strong the predictive power of the relationship is. There's typically more variation within than between most demographic groups. A frequency distribution shows a score on the x-axis and the percentage of people who got the score on the y-axis. In that blue graph, you see that most people got a mid-range score on that variable. There were less and less people who had increasingly high or low scores, and very few people with extremely high or low scores. And you should recognize that as a normal distribution. That's a very common distribution for variables that are measured by psychologists. If a variable is normally distributed, it means that with regard to that score on the variable, most people are average. Now, the second set of figures shows the overlap between two distributions. Let's pretend that the blue distribution is for men and the pink distribution is for women, and the distribution represents their scores on a particular trait. The graphs are showing that on this variable, men score higher on average than women. The black bars indicate the difference between the means of the distributions, which fall at their center. So the mean would be around here for women and there for men. For the small effect, the difference is 5 points wide. It goes between like 50 and 55. For the large effect, it's about 10 points wide, going from 50 to 60. And for the very large effect, it is 15 points wide, from 50 to 65. Notice how much overlap there is between the distributions, how wide that purple space is. That's the illustration of the point that there's more variation within a distribution than between the two distributions. The width of that black line represents the average difference between the two distributions. The distributions themselves and the purple space of overlap between them is a lot wider than that. When we talk about differences between groups, we often wonder about their cause, whether it's nature, genetics, biology, or nurture, social and environmental influences. That particular question is the subject of the field of behavior genetics. There are social and political consequences to the identification of differences and their causes, especially when the variable is something that's prized by society, say intelligence, or despised by society, say violent crime. If the cause of a difference is or is thought to be biological, it means something. There is some social implication for that fact. For non-heterosexual transgender people, the biological basis of sexuality and gender identity could mean that they're born that way and they shouldn't be stigmatized for having made a choice that some people construct as bad. That can be liberating. On the other hand, the hereditary nature of intelligence has been used as a justification for eugenics, for forced sterilization, for forced labor, genocide. And then if the cause of a difference is nurture, if it's social, environmental, then it follows that we have to be aware of our collective social responsibility for managing it if it's a problem. If a difference in crime rate between groups is mostly attributable to environmental factors like poverty, well, what should we do about that? What systemic, structural, or cultural issues do we need to address? I'm now going to play a 5-minute video on the subject from your textbook, and you'll have access to videos like this and many more if you've got Launchpad.
You can't understand human nature without thinking about how humans evolved. The fact that we're products of natural selection explains some of our deepest strivings, why we love our children, why we love our spouses, why we enjoy sex, why we strive to stay alive. All of these are exactly what you'd expect as the outcome of the Darwinian process.
At the heart of Pinker's new work is an assault on a cherished conviction that has dominated intellectual life. That when you were born, your mind was a blank slate, and your character formed by the culture you live in.
The blank slate refers to the idea that the mind has no inherent structure, that babies are born without any talents or abilities, and that the entire mind and personality is a product of the environment, of socialization by parents, and of absorption of values from the culture.
The blank slate is immensely pervasive in the social sciences that still react in a sort of emotional way to the idea that genes have anything to do with those aspects of human behavior which are of sort of social interest. Yes, it's very pervasive.
Why has the idea that your human nature is sculpted from nurture rather than nature carried such weight?
Well, there are some politically and morally attractive features of the doctrine of the blank slate. If all of us are born with nothing, that means that all of us are by definition equal, and there's no room a priori for some people or one sex or one race to be smarter or faster or healthier or more conscientious or than any other. If we're all blank slates, then by definition we're all equal.
And the blank slate was not merely a laudable liberal aim. It was also a reaction to the dark heart of a century.
Part of the appeal of the blank slate is that the opposite view, the idea that there's a biological constitution to humans, was horrendously perverted in the late 19th and early decades of the 20th century. In eugenics, the desire to reshape humans by biological means. In social Darwinism, the idea that the upper classes or dominant nations deserve their success and were carrying out the wisdom of nature, and that the downtrodden and the poor were being eliminated as part of the process of survival of the fittest. And most horrifically of all, in Nazism, the idea that there were superior and inferior races, that the superior races were being contaminated by interbreeding, and that it was part of the process of evolution that the inferior races be eliminated. And it's quite legitimate to refute and to denounce the pseudo-scientific beliefs about biology and race that led to those horrors.
But the 20th century was blighted by more than Nazism. And in the other epic atrocities, Steven Pinker believes the blank slate was an ideological driving force.
There were two sets of holocausts in the 20th century, and the other one was carried out by the Marxist regimes of Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and others. That remarkably, their theory of biology and human nature was the exact opposite of the social Darwinism behind Nazism.
China's Cultural Revolution killed millions in its attempt to remold the people of the Republic. And Chairman Mao asserted boldly that on a blank sheet of paper can be written the most beautiful words. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge captured the spirit of the blank slate in the slogan, "Only the newborn baby is spotless."
If the mind is indefinitely malleable, then that opens the door to a totalitarian regime to do the molding. If people are being molded anyway, may as well do it systematically instead of allowing it to happen haphazardly. And so it justifies totalitarian social engineering. So ironically, Nazism and Marxism share the idea that humanity could be reshaped. In the case of Nazis, by biological means. In the case of the Marxists, by social means.
Obviously, there is some biological basis to all behavior. Let's say that you took a tiny kitten away from its mother and hand-raised it, and you read to it every day, and you did your best to teach it to read. Are you going to end up with an adult cat that can read? Obviously not. Nurture works on what nature provides. You can only teach a human to read, and you need to do that while the human's young enough. It's very hard to teach an adult who never learned to read to do so. They won't achieve a high reading level. By that point, the brain just doesn't have the neuroplasticity, the ability to make new connections that's required to learn that. There are biologically based critical periods for learning things, especially language. Cats can't read because they don't have the genetic basis. They don't have the cognitive apparatus to learn to read. And it doesn't matter how hard you try or what technique you use or how long you spend at it, your cat will never be able to learn to read. Humans do have that genetic basis. Watson and Rayner were able to teach a human child to fear a rat by pairing the rat with a loud, scary noise. Once they took the noise away and showed the child the rat again, that child, poor little Albert, was scared of the rat, and he also generalized his fear to other white fluffy things. He was scared of things like a bunny or a Santa beard. And that demonstrates a human ability for stimulus generalization. Humans can generalize their fear of something to other things, to other similar circumstances. People with post-traumatic stress disorder generalize their fear of something that happened in the past, maybe even a long time ago, far away, to the present, here and now, even if they know that that thing isn't likely to occur. And that capacity to readily make associations and generalize across them is very human. There have been many efforts, not particularly successful, to create a rat model of PTSD. Researchers have tried their best to give rats PTSD, for example, by putting them in situations that scare them. Cat exposure. While the rats are very scared in the fearful environment, they tend not to carry that fear around with them. They don't generalize it back to the home cage environment where the cat is gone. People have a different cognitive capacity to learn, and that includes learning fear, but rats don't have. And that comes down to genetic differences. Heredity refers to the genetic transfer of characteristics from parents to their offspring. Gregor Mendel identified it in the characteristics of pea plants, like their height or the color of the flowers, the shape of the pods, and Francis Galton identified it in intelligence. Heritability is a population-level outcome. It means that, say, 50% of the variance in IQ scores observed in the population, think of the totality of everyone's deviation from an average, is attributable to genetic factors. It does not mean that 50% of your IQ score reflects your parents' intelligence and the other 50% from your home and school environment or nutrition. It's not an individual level measure. Heritability is a relative and contextual measure that reflects factors in the design of a study. First of all, it depends on the range of the variable in the sample. Let's say I measured the heritability of intelligence, use the students in this class as a study sample. Well, I'm not working with the whole range of IQ scores in the population. I'm working with, at best, the top half, because you're all smart enough to get into university. The range is restricted. The small differences in IQ between yourselves would look like they were caused by chance, and my study might suggest a low role of heritability in IQ. The textbook gives a rather cruel example of raising boys in barrels until they are 12 and then measuring their intelligence. Now, if you actually did anything like that, there'd be no development of intelligence to measure. The idea is attributed to Mark Twain. It's not what he actually said, which is just as bad, if not even worse. The example illustrates the point that if everyone in the study had the same environment, that range restriction on environment would force you to conclude that 100% of the variance in IQ scores that you observed in the children were due to heredity. It can't be due to environment. It's not a variable that can predict anything anymore, because now it's not even a variable. There's no variance in environment to account for any of the variance, for any of the differences in IQ scores at the end of the study. Of course, environment does have an effect. All the study subjects would have very low IQs, if they were even detectable. But environment could not account for the differences in individual IQ scores because all the subjects had the same environment. Researchers commonly determine the heritability of a trait through twin studies. Identical twins have the same genetics. The only thing that's different is their environment. If we want to look at the role of heredity, we can compare identical twins raised together to fraternal twins raised together. Twins raised together are raised in overwhelmingly similar environments. We can see the genetic role in the development of schizophrenia, and that fraternal twins raised together are less likely to both develop schizophrenia than identical twins raised together. If we want to study the role of environment, we would look at identical twins raised apart. Same genetics, different environments. Studies of identical twins raised apart have found very strong similarities between the twins. The Jim twins had the same jobs. They both had dogs. They both had wives named Linda. But how much do adoptive homes really differ? There are a lot of social controls on who can adopt children, and those are overwhelmingly well-to-do families. You're not looking at the whole range of family environments, which would run between raised by wolves to adopted into the most advantaged, skilled family you could imagine. So what about identical twins who are raised in radically different environments? There is a case where one twin was Jewish and the other was a Nazi. They spoke different languages and chose different careers, and they had a lot of difficulty establishing a relationship, which they ultimately did after they discovered they had the same taste for playing practical jokes. They were also observed to have some things in common, including very particular habits, like flushing the toilet before using it. Now, what if a child was actually raised by wolves? What would the role of environment look like then? This actually does happen. Human children have been raised by social animals, most notably dogs. These are extreme circumstances, and they demonstrate a large role of environment. The children grow up to act like the animals that raised them. Depending on how late they're found, they may never develop the ability to speak or act like a human because the past the critical periods in which to learn those behaviors. Here's an example from Russia.
Oksana Malaya began her life living with dogs. Rejected by her mother and father, she somehow survived for 6 years, living wild, before being taken into care. There are few cases of feral children who have been able to fully compensate for the neglect they suffered. Oksana is now 22, but her future still hangs in the balance. Have scientists learned enough from previous cases to rehabilitate her? For 6 years, Oksana Malaya spent her life living in a kennel with dogs. Totally abandoned by her mother and father, she was discovered behaving more like an animal than a human child. For 2 centuries, wild children have been the objects of fascinating study. Raised without love or social interaction, wild or feral children pose the question, what is it that makes us human? Since Oksana's discovery, scientists have looked for clues in the handful of other recorded cases of feral children in their efforts to rehabilitate her. She's made astonishing progress in ways that many thought impossible. And now, aged 22, Oksana wants to take an extraordinary final step, to be reunited with the parents who neglected her.
I want to see them with my own eyes so desperately, because I have been told I have no parents. But actually, I do have them.
One of the central questions in all of science that has to do with humans is, are we a product of our genes or are we a product of our experience? The old nature-nurture issue.
Feral children tap into this because they are the natural experiment that we're not allowed to carry out. Part of being a human is being brought up by humans. If you're not brought up by humans, are you completely human?
When this happens, it's known as a natural experiment. It would certainly not be ethical to run that study. Harry Harlow's animal research on the effects of social deprivation in monkeys was so heart-wrenching that it precipitated the development of institutional ethics review boards for psychological research on animals. Adoption by a human family is a much better arrangement. We can study adoptive families to look at the role of genetic differences. Adoptive family members share the same home environment but have more genetic diversity between the members. Research on adoption suggests that adopted children tend to be more similar to their genetic relatives than their adoptive parents, for example, in personality or cognitive ability. That said, they do tend to have better outcomes than their siblings who were not adopted. That's because if a child is given up for adoption or removed from their parent, it is, or should be, for a good reason, and that's because it's in the best interests of the child. Families that are approved to adopt children jump through a lot of hoops to demonstrate that they're competent to do so. Otherwise, there's no such thing as a parenting license. Here's a fun fact. There's probably someone out there who looks identical to you but isn't your identical twin. There are a limited number of facial features out there. There are about 8 different kinds of noses or lips. Nobody has a nose shaped like a house or a pineapple. And with 7 billion people out there, someone else will surely have your facial configuration, and they might have an account on twinstrangers.net where you can find them. Now, since there isn't a strong genetic relationship, your doppelganger is not likely to share your personality or other traits in the way identical twins would. Nature and nurture interact. Nurture works on what nature provides. Your cat will never learn to read, but your cat does have the cognitive apparatus to learn other complex behaviors, ones that are relatively simpler, like using a toilet. The brain responds to learning and experience by developing synapses, by developing new connections between brain cells. Rats that are raised in enriched environments show greater brain development. Rats that are raised in impoverished environments have less. Now, it's easier for children to develop those connections. They're critical periods for learning. If you want to learn a new language without an accent, you need to learn it in childhood. And that applies to learning language at all. To maintain those connections, you need to keep using that skill. If you, say, learn to figure skate and then stop skating for years, will be a considerable decline in your skating ability as your brain and your muscles develop towards doing the things that you're actually doing. However, if you go back on the ice, you won't be like a first-time skater. You'll retain something and you'll relearn faster than a new skater, faster than it would take someone of the same age to learn it for the first time. After puberty, the brain prunes off unused connections, and it becomes more difficult, though it is obviously still possible, to learn new things. Something else that develops over time is your personality. As we get older, we develop more socially desirable personality traits. We become more agreeable and more emotionally stable over our lifespan. That said, we all come with a hardwired temperament. Differences in temperament are evident at birth. There are happy babies, calm babies, and cranky babies. And that cranky baby is going to run a little cranky their whole life. Some people's nervous systems are just more reactive than others. Some of us have more emotional ups and downs. It's called the personality trait of neuroticism, and always will, though we can definitely learn skills to regulate and manage our emotions. We've learned that introverts tend to be more sensitive to stimulation and more aroused at baseline, and that extroverts tend to be less sensitive to stimulation and less aroused at baseline. Traits like introversion and neuroticism have an evident biological basis in the sensitivity and reactivity of the nervous system. Experience can even change the expression of genes. Epigenetics is the discipline that studies environmental influences on gene expression. Think of the effects of toxins, stress, and nutrition on your body and its development. Over a very long period of time, we as a species have evolved to be hardwired to do things that are adaptive. People who behave in more adaptive ways are going to be more likely to leave offspring that survive and reproduce to pass on that trait. Traits like aggression are adaptive. Sometimes one way to get resources is to successfully fight for them. The same principle of adaptivity applies to cultural differences. Different cultures exist in different physical environments where people had to learn to navigate different challenges. Surviving in a desert is a different game than surviving in a jungle or over a harsh winter, and winning at those games requires different skills and habits. Over time, they led to different traditions. Cultures pass down socially learned behaviors that, at least at some point, help the group solve problems and survive. Sometimes traditions aren't adaptive in the modern world. Whether something is adaptive depends on the context and your goals. The practice of polyandry in Tibet relates closely to the exigencies of farming the land in that region. It helps control the population in rocky, rural areas where farmable land is scarce. Cultures that relied on the farming of wheat are more individualistic than cultures that relied on the farming of rice, which requires a much higher degree of cooperation. For example, just to irrigate the land. Irrigation is very complex, and so it requires a high level of community decision-making and cooperation. The text uses known gender differences in sexuality between men and women to illustrate the evolutionary perspective. It is a well-replicated and cross-cultural finding that men, on average, are more sexually motivated than women. You can see this reflected in the erotica that's marketed to men or to women. For men, it tends to be very visual and gets straight to the point. For women, it tends to be a lot more verbal and narrative with character development and relationship drama. Evolutionary psychology would ask, how is that adaptive? How did that help us survive and reproduce as a species? Compared to women, there are fewer costs and more benefits to promiscuity for men. It means more potential pregnancies and opportunities to pass on one's genes and that trait. On the other hand, there's not much procreative benefit to having a lot of sex for a woman. She can only get pregnant a few days a month. It also means that all the personal risks and costs, say of internal STIs, of carrying a pregnancy to term, of giving birth, which until recently was very dangerous, and of raising the child. Women typically do much more child raising, including breastfeeding. For her to successfully pass on her genes, it makes more sense for her to invest, and that's a high investment, in seeing a few children survive to adulthood. It's more important to her to have a guy around who can provide safety and resources and help raise that child. Men tend to be more sexually attracted to women who look young and healthy and fertile, and who have wide hips, which translates to an easier childbirth experience. Women tend to be more attracted to powerful men who have and who control resources. If men are shown a picture of a woman in a luxury car or a beat-up car, their ratings of the attractiveness of the woman have nothing to do with the car. On the other hand, women's ratings of the physical attractiveness of a man are affected by the car. The man in the luxury car is rated as more attractive. So those car ads do have a point. Overall, women are much choosier maters than men and say no more often. These tendencies reflect an evolutionary history where women are making the decisions that optimize the survival of the offspring, and part of that is choosing the best father. Some of the differences we observe between genders reflect biological differences. For example, testosterone is known to increase sex drive. Sex is defined based on biological characteristics, what's between a baby's legs, and can be male, female, or intersex. On the other hand, gender refers to physical, social, and behavioral characteristics that are associated with cultural gender roles and the psychological sense of identity. Girls wear pink, boys wear blue, men go to work, and women stay home with the kids. Those social roles can change over time and place. A person's gender identity is an interplay between their biological disposition, their developmental experiences, and their social situation. Caster Semenya is an intersex athlete who identifies as a woman. That's caused some consternation for the groups that regulate athletic competitions. That represents a structural and social problem. There's nothing wrong with her. The textbook summarizes gender differences between men and women that have been reliably found in the psychological literature. Women tend to be more relationship-oriented, more likely to work in helping professions, like psychology, to have more supportive and democratic styles, be less motivated by pay. They're more likely to be religious and more likely to perpetrate relational aggression, like social bullying, gossip and rumor spreading. There are certain psychological disorders that are more likely in women. Those are mood disorders, attachment disorders like borderline personality disorder, and eating disorders. Men are more likely to be found working in STEM fields. That stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Or leadership positions. They have more directive or task-based styles and are more motivated by pay. They're more likely to have autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, antisocial personality disorder, and criminal convictions, to have substance use disorders or die by suicide. They're less likely to be religious and more likely to perpetrate physical aggression. Differences in gendered behavior increase through childhood and adolescence and peak in the child-raising years. They reduce again after age 50. To some extent, that reflects changes in levels of sex hormones. Testosterone and estrogen do have observable effects on the body, on cognition, on emotion, and on behavior. There's a lot of social construction behind what we consider normal and abnormal, acceptable and unacceptable, behind what behaviors we characterize as a psychological disorder or mental illness. The American Psychological Association once considered homosexuality a mental disorder, and in some countries it's criminalized. In Saudi Arabia, the punishment is so severe it includes the death penalty. If you were taking an intro to psych course at a Saudi Arabian university, I don't think you'd be hearing that homosexuality or differences in gender expression are normal or acceptable. We stigmatize men who like wearing dresses a lot more than women who like wearing pantsuits. In reality, there is no scientific reason to construct diversity in gender expression as a mental disorder. Gender dysphoria refers to the sense that one's gender identity doesn't match with one's sex. The treatment options are highly personal. Some people accept not fitting into a box, and some people seek hormonal or surgical solutions. There's also a great deal of diversity in family life, what families look like and how children are raised. Children from all kinds of different families and communities turn out just fine, even in environments we might consider quite different or deprived. What does matter is the extremes of neglect and abuse. Keeping in mind that we're talking about North American culture, parents and peers have different influences on behavior. Parents have more influence on religion, education, career path, responsibility, and the way we react to authority figures. Peers have more influence on what's cool, how to act in social situations, what kind of music to listen to, and what clothes to wear. They also influence our habits. You might do what your friends do. And if your parents are immigrants to Canada, even if they're the ones that taught you English, you probably don't sound like them. Probably sound like the kids you went to school with. The highest level of social organization is culture, and culture has a profound effect on behavior and thinking. Culture refers to the ideas, attitudes, values, lifestyle habits, and traditions that are shared by a group of people, and that is passed on through social learning to future generations. Within a society, there'll be a number of subcultures associated with class, religion, etc. Even organizations and industries have cultures. Entrepreneurs operate within a different workplace culture than academics. Cultures have norms. Those are standards for acceptable and expected behavior that might be strange or shocking to people outside that culture, which would make so much sense to the people in it that they're reflexive or even invisible to them. Culture is based on assumptions that we make, and those assumptions refer to how the social group solved the problems and overcame the challenges that it encountered over the long term. Some cultures are more individualistic, and some cultures are more collectivistic. Individualist cultures value independence. They promote personal ideals, identity, strengths, goals. Achievements are attributed to personal strengths, and there's value for competition, for standing up for yourself. Collectivistic cultures value interdependence, more about group and social goals, fitting in, doing your duty, and respecting traditions. Achievements are more often attributed to mutual support, and the society values cooperation with others and obedience to authority. These ways of thinking and doing represent adaptations to the environment, where individualism led to success. Societies that are based on rice farming are more collectivistic. Cultures change over time. You're not living in your great-grandparents' society or in the Middle Ages. Values and assumptions change. Women can drive now, even in Saudi Arabia, and you probably don't support eugenics or want to die for king and country. Those changes have happened too quickly to reflect genetic or biological factors. Women didn't acquire some gene representing the cognitive ability to drive or vote in the last 100 years. Cultural ideas about what women can and should do, and therefore do, changed. IQ scores for marginalized ethnic groups have dramatically increased over the last century, and that probably reflects better access to resources, including nutrition and education, and reduced stress. While culture shock is real, national stereotypes tend to exaggerate cultural differences. For example, Canadians and Americans might think they're very different, but they are in fact very similar, especially from the perspective of people outside North America. Bias against certain groups exists and can be demonstrated experimentally. When researchers take identical resumes and put a white-sounding name, like Kyle, or a black-sounding name, like Tyrone, on the resume, or have carefully trained white or black actors go out to apply for real jobs, the white actors and the resumes with white names get more callbacks or job offers, about 50% more. Research from St. Mary's University found that only the resumes with black names were picked on for their writing and formatting, even though they're the exact same resumes that we used with the white names. The only time anyone ever rejected a candidate because they deserved a better job was when the candidate had a white name. That comment on the slide demonstrates ableism, by the way. Why does having a physical disability make someone a good fit for a monotonous job? It implies that they're excluded from the labor market and should be happy to get any job. When bias is embedded into a structure or systemic, it's systemic. It's a systemic ism. A workplace that's built and equipped with the assumption that employees can see or hear or climb stairs could be described as systemically ableist. Only able-bodied employees would be able to perform and succeed. Systems that aren't built with the needs of minority groups in mind have to find ways to accommodate and include diverse identities. That workplace has to build ramps and provide assistive technology, or the services of an interpreter. If you want to identify systemic barriers, look for the assumptions behind the way a system is designed. What assumptions lie behind the way I'm delivering this class? Who does that privilege and who does that marginalize? It's heavy on reading and writing. What does that mean for a student with dyslexia? And what am I going to do to accommodate their different needs? It's possible to be biased against any individual or demographic. It's possible for members of a demographic group to discriminate against members of their own group. A good example of that is when women slut-shame other women. How much that harms the targeted person or group depends on differences in personal and social power and vulnerability. In the context of this class, if you're biased against me, that would probably do less harm to me than it would to you if I was biased against you. That's because in this context, I have more power. So how do we detect bias? There are lots of ways. If you want to make a case that something or someone is a problem, there are ways to ask the question that make for artificially high or low results. I have a background in epidemiology and the estimation of prevalence, and I notice when that happens. Using really broad definitions of a construct, like defining violence as when somebody looks at you the wrong way, produce really high prevalence rates, especially when paired with really long prevalence periods, like ever in your entire life. Have you ever done this or experienced this? Using very stringent definitions and very short prevalence periods, like did this impossible thing happen today, produce artificially low prevalence rates. The way those numbers, those prevalence rates are then reported might suggest that there is a huge problem or no problem. What and who do we construct as a problem? Sometimes we pathologize behavior that causes little or no harm, like homosexuality or diversity in gender expression. I want to draw your attention to something in the text, male answer syndrome. The textbook claims that men are more likely to hazard a guess when they don't know an answer to a question, rather than to humbly admit that they don't know. The book identifies this as male answer syndrome, which sounds like a psychological disorder or mental illness. It also sounds like a reliable finding, a phenomenon that the scientific community has accepted. Researchers have called this the male answer syndrome. When I looked up this reference a few months ago on Google Scholar, it led me to a record of a talk at a conference, one that's been cited 2 times. People can say a lot of things at conferences. Conference presentations don't get the same quality of review as a peer-reviewed journal article. And in the 20 years since that talk was given, it didn't lead to any papers. Those 2 citations aren't even from journals. I searched for the reference again today, and now it looks like the record isn't even being indexed. This concept has no currency in the scientific literature in psychology. So why are they bringing it up? Mansplaining, which is also in your textbook, is also not a validated psychological construct. A Google Scholar search of this term doesn't lead to a single psychology journal article. There are academic articles on this subject, mostly in feminist philosophy journals, but none that I could find in psychology. The construct doesn't belong with this discipline. Mansplaining refers to the idea that a man might explain something to a woman in a condescending or patronizing tone, and that could be irritating. I'm not seeing any jokes about things women do that men might find irritating. Bias can also be reflected in the practice of pathologizing people for problems that are caused by the environment. Prevalence rates for ADHD are much higher in North America, where you could argue that the classroom practices and structures that we use, particularly in children's educations, are not as good a fit for boys as they are for girls. So if a little boy is jumping out of his desk or not listening, not seeming to benefit from that, does the little boy have a mental illness that requires medication or treatment, or is the issue in how well the environment is serving that child's learning needs? We criminalize certain behaviors. At one point in our history, and currently in many parts of the world, homosexuality was criminalized. Oscar Wilde went to prison. It's hard to argue that the use of marijuana causes as much social and personal harm as the use of alcohol. What would the practice of criminalizing marijuana use, but not alcohol use, mean for African Americans who are more likely to use marijuana? Bias also comes through in selective reporting, in the way we tell a story, in what facts we select to construct a narrative. The module on gender differences shies away from reporting what men are better at, for example, spatial abilities such as object rotation, such as the ability to rotate an object in your mind. It attributes gender stratification in STEM fields, in which more men are employed, to discrimination against women, without considering the role of gender differences in interests. Men do report being more interested in what are called realistic or investigative work environments, ones that involve working with mechanical things or doing research. Women report more interest in social and conventional occupations. Social occupations refer to helping professions like nursing or teaching or psychology, and conventional occupations are ones that feature orderliness and routine, like clerical work. In countries with less social discrimination, gender differences in occupational choice don't get smaller, they get bigger. Higher occupational gender stratification is actually associated with a lower gender gap in pay. People and groups who are free to choose may choose differently from each other. And as long as people aren't encountering unfair barriers to pursuing the work they want, we don't need to construct a gender difference favoring males as a problem. I didn't love the boys in barrels joke about determining the genetic versus environmental influences on a behavior or trait. It's explicitly child abuse, and running that kind of experiment would be unethical. Are unethical research experiments funny? Would the authors have considered making a joke? Would the authors and editors have considered making a joke like that about teenage girls, who can also be difficult sometimes? This kind of joke comes up again in the module on antisocial behavior. Men do perpetrate more violent crimes than women, and these rates are highest for young men, and men do have higher rates of antisocial personality disorder. There is no such thing as cryogenic sleep. That's the stuff of science fiction. And in practice, this would be actually violent, in contrast to the epistemic violence of mansplaining. It would actually kill them. Cryogenics cannot be performed on living subjects, and it wouldn't solve the problem anyway. If you put 12-year-old boys into some kind of suspended animation for 16 years, they wouldn't wake up as socially and emotionally mature 29-year-old young adults. Maturation is a process. Social and personal process. What the joke insinuates is that you could solve a social problem by eliminating the demographic that contributes to the problem. That's not a good, in the sense of effective or ethical, way to solve a complex social problem, and we don't appreciate that line of thinking when it's applied to other demographics. There's more selective reporting in that the text tells you that men and women have the same average or mean intelligence scores, which is true, but not that there's evidence for a difference in variance. would mean that the shape of the distributions are different, such that men outnumber women at both the low and the high extremes. There are taboo subjects in psychology that are controversial for political reasons, and that's one of them. Another way we can see bias is in the free and easy application of negative stereotypes against the group. Certain groups do, in fact, have higher crime rates, but one still must be aware of the use of criminal stereotypes. There's a sociological argument that justifies the disparagement of groups that have more social power. That would say it's only sexist if the gender-based negative bias targets women. That says there's no such thing as a reverse-ism. Context matters, and that's an argument that's best applied to the very high level of social systems and structures, to the systemic. Sociology and psychology are different disciplines. Psychology, we focus on the individual and on how individuals relate to groups, and we're cognizant of individual differences and vulnerability. If a psychological study includes 50 men or 50 women, that usually means 50 individual men or 50 individual women. And we want to make a generalization to some general, universal, individual man or woman. They're not being studied as a social group of 50. And often social context isn't adequately considered. And context always matters. A subset of students who sign up for Introduction to Psychology courses do so because they've struggled with mental illness. They want to learn more about it. I regularly encounter students with depression, and the few students who've expressed some form of suicidal ideation to me have been male. Do I, as the instructor, want to be assigning them that content to read? No, I don't. I don't want to assume that it's safe or acceptable or funny to disparage or show contempt for any particular demographic group. And when I get the opportunity to do so, I will provide feedback to the textbook publisher and change the book, but that is a major undertaking. Thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions and comments on Brightspace or by email. For the next lecture, please read modules 20 to 22 on memory. I'll see you then.